Hey everybody, it's Mr. Bliss. This video is about the circulatory system. In our last video, we talked about the digestive system. The next video will focus on the respiratory system. These organ systems are going to come together, and we're leading up to talk about cell respiration, which includes all of them. Again, if you have not watched the series on macromolecules, I would recommend going back and watching that before you get into the organ system videos. So anyway, let's get started. What I would like you to do is picture a city. Specifically, what I'd like you to do is picture a city that has a big wall around it. If you just left that city alone and didn't allow anybody in or out, eventually that city would probably destroy itself. Either the people would starve, or there would be no energy coming into the city to power anything, or there would be no waste that was being brought out. So let's actually write those things down. So you need energy coming in, you need food, you need water, and then also coming out, you need to get rid of your wastes. Okay, food waste, sewer waste, all that stuff. Well, if you instead replace, in this analogy, your city with a cell, the same thing happens. The cell will eventually die if it does not get raw materials, if it doesn't get energy, and if it doesn't get rid of the waste products. So that's where the circulatory system comes into play. The circulatory system is all about transportation. It's all about transportation, and the way that it does that is with the blood. So all of those things get carried in the blood. So let's actually look at some of the things in the blood. We actually have 4 major components in the blood. The first are our red blood cells. Okay, and our red blood cells look a little bit like this. They're like these discs, and they don't have a nucleus. They're denucleated cells. Their function is to carry gases. Carries gases. Like oxygen and carbon dioxide. They have these special proteins in the cells themselves called hemoglobin. You may have heard that word before. And hemoglobin is where you have your iron. That's why it's important to have iron in some of the foods that you eat. Sometimes your cereal is fortified with iron. And it makes it better at carrying these gases and transporting it from your lungs to your cells, and then from your cells back as waste out of your lungs. These are red blood cells, or erythrocytes. We also have these sort of cells that are called white blood cells. Okay, white blood cells, or leukocytes, and they look a little bit, they're much larger than your red blood cells. This actually isn't even really a comparison. These white blood cells are much larger. But our leukocytes are important for your immune system. They help to catch things like bacteria that have found their way into your body, and they keep your body safe from infection rather. We also have these things called platelets, or thrombocytes, and platelets they're small. They're kind of these like tile-shaped things, and their function is that they help to clot the blood. So clotting factors. If you ever get a cut, these are the things that stop your bleeding. That's why you put pressure on your wounds, and these platelets will eventually stop that bleeding. If you have too many platelets and too much fat in your body, you could end up with blood clots, though, and that's bad. And the last thing in your blood is called plasma. And plasma is kind of it's a liquid, but it's very important because although it's mostly made up of water, it also includes your nutrients. So you have water, nutrients, you have some ions like salts, you also have hormones. Okay, all of these things are carried in the plasma. And these are all of the goodies. These are the things that your blood is transporting to your cells. In our series on macromolecules, we talked about carbohydrates, we talked about fats, lipids, proteins, and then in our last video we talked about digestion and how these nutrients get into our bloodstream. Well, this is how these nutrients get to our cells. So if we take an overview, a large overview of our circulatory system, it looks a little bit like this. Our heart, which does not look like this, but it's an easy way to represent it, is in the center of our circulatory system. And together our heart, our lungs, our heart, our blood, and our blood vessels, which carry the blood, make up our circulatory system. And although that word circle is in the word circulatory, circulation is actually not in a circle. It's in this kind of figure 8 pattern, where blood goes from our heart to our lungs, up here like this, where it gets oxygenated, and then that oxygenated blood returns, I should have switched these arrows here, to our heart. And that is our first loop in the circulatory system. It's known as our pulmonary loop. If you've ever studied Latin or Spanish, pulmones in Spanish is lungs, so that's a good way to remember that. And then from our heart we go through the second loop, where the heart pumps again, and all of that oxygenated blood goes to our body cells, where it delivers all of these important things here to our cells. And it picks up our waste and brings it back to the heart. Brings it back to the heart here, which brings it to the lungs, and then leaves the body through the respiratory system, which is in our next video. So how does it do that? Let's take a look at the heart itself. So our heart is a mammalian heart. We're mammals. And it's split up into 4 chambers. So chambers or rooms. And those are called the atria, which are at the top, and the ventricles, which are located at the bottom. One of the things you'll notice in this diagram is that the right atrium is on the left-hand side of the diagram. But if you imagine that heart was inside of a person already, here's our person, not a very good one. Okay, ooh, that's really bad. That this would be the person's right arm, and this would be the person's left arm. So you just have to imagine that it's already inside of a human when you're figuring out left and right. So what are the rest of these parts? We have some major blood vessels here that we're going to focus on. So let's start up here. So this is the vena cava. Okay, and veins return blood to the heart. So for example, if you were pumping the blood back from the brain, it would be going through this superior vena cava. If you were pumping blood back to the heart from the lower part of the body, it would be coming from down here. This is the inferior vena cava, which means below. But they all return to the same place. They come together into this right atrium. And what the atria do is they hold the blood, so they just kind of collect it. And it doesn't drop down into this bottom chamber because of this thing up here known as a valve. And the valve prevents the flow of blood in the wrong direction. When it's ready, that blood then flows down through into the right ventricle here. And this is a larger chamber, and you'll notice that it's surrounded by muscle here. And that muscle contracts, and it sends blood this way. Okay. Now remember, this blood is coming back to the heart from the cells already, so it's deoxygenated. It's full of waste that needs to be expelled. And the way that it does that is it goes through this blood vessel that's known as the pulmonary artery. So veins over here return blood to the heart, and now we have arteries that pump blood away from the heart. You can always remember that arteries pump blood away. And you'll notice here that when it gets to the top of this little T intersection, the pulmonary arteries split this way and this way. Well, the reason why is because, just as we saw in this pulmonary loop, we're going to the lungs. And so you have a left lung and a right lung, and that's where that split happens. So when it gets to the lungs, you'll see gas exchange. I'll write that down here. Gas exchange, which we're going to look at more in our next video on the respiratory system. But what happens is carbon dioxide leaves the blood and oxygen enters the blood. And so we now have oxygenated blood. And that means that we're dealing with the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart deals with oxygenated blood. The right side deals with deoxygenated blood. So let's look at that. As we saw, we went out of the pulmonary artery. Okay, I'm switching to blue. I don't know why I'm switching the colors the way that most videos don't use. We're kind of inverting it here, but that's okay. So blood is going to return, oxygenated blood is going to return back into the heart through the pulmonary veins. So veins return blood to the heart. So we're going to come into this left atrium. It's going to collect in there. It's not going to flow into the ventricle yet. It's going to collect, and then it's going to drop down into the ventricle. Now you'll actually notice that the left ventricle is the largest chamber. It has more muscle in it than the right ventricle does. And that's because when we pump here, we're actually going to be sending blood all the way around the body. We're sending it to the tips of the fingers, all the way down to the toes, all the way up to the brain, your eyes, your muscles. Every single cell needs to receive this blood. And so it needs to pump very, very hard. Whenever you feel your pulse, for example, in your neck or in your wrist, what you're feeling is the pulse of the left ventricle. You don't feel the pulse of the right ventricle because that one only goes to the lungs. However, if you listen to a heartbeat, you might hear that double beat, that ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. That first pulse is your pulmonary loop, and then the louder second pulse is your systemic loop. So there, your left ventricle pumps very hard. It goes this way through this artery here. This is the largest artery in the body, known as the aorta. And you'll notice that the aorta splits in multiple directions here. This is the aortic arch. You have one that goes to the left arm, the right arm, then this one goes to the brain. Okay, you have your carotid artery there. And then it actually loops down around the back of the heart this way. And this is the descending aorta, which goes to your kidneys, it goes to your legs, the lower part of the body. And it's very important. So if you followed these paths, they would branch on and on and on, almost like this. So you have, for example, your aorta, which is very thick, and then that branches into your arteries, and your arteries then split into smaller and smaller bits that we call, so here you are, whoop, let's try that again. So you have your arteries, and then these split into smaller bits that are called arterioles. And then at the very end of this section, you have these very, very small blood vessels that are known as capillaries or capillaries. Either way is fine, how to say that. And your capillaries are very, very small. In some places, they're as thin as a single blood cell that can squeeze through at a time. And your capillaries are the things that are delivering the nutrients right to your cells. So I've actually drawn right at the top here. This is kind of a diagram of where your capillaries end, and they interact with your cells that are kind of surrounding these. This is like the drop-off zone for your nutrients, but also the pickup zone for your waste. And then it goes the other way. So let's say that you're now going from your cells. You have your tiny capillaries like this. Okay, these are your capillaries again. And then these come together to form small collecting blood vessels that are called your venules. And just like your arterioles were small arteries, your venules are small veins. And then these come together to form, this is not a great diagram, your veins. Your arteries are usually thicker than your veins because they have to receive a lot of pressure through them. Your veins are unique because they have these valves kind of through them to prevent backflow of blood. Your low pressure blood doesn't want to flow backwards. So that all comes together and returns eventually back through the vena cava to the heart. It is fairly straightforward. However, the way to really understand the circulatory system is to look at it in connection with the respiratory system. Those two systems together are known as the cardiovascular system, and that's what we want to understand in order to understand the circulatory system and building up to respiration. So that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. I can try to answer them in the comments.